Welcome to the Voices for Voices TV show and podcast. I am your host, founder, and executive director of Voices for Voices, Justin Allen Hayes. We ask you here to subscribe, like, share this episode to give us the ability to share the content and the great experiences and stories of our guests to ultimately join in that goal of mine to help 3 billion people over the course of my lifetime and beyond. Voices for Voices is the #1 ranked podcast and TV show where people turn to for expert mental health, recovery, and career advancement intelligence. Our TV show and podcast is all about teaching you insanely actionable techniques to help you prosper, grow yourself, your self-worth, and your personal brand. So if you're a high achiever or someone who wants more out of life, whether mentally, physically, or spiritually, please make sure you subscribe to our TV show and podcast right now. As you can see, the Voices for Voices TV show and podcast publishes episodes that focus on case studies, real-life examples, actionable tips, and in-the-trenches reports and interviews from subscribers just like you. If that sounds like something that could help you or somebody you know grow personally or professionally, then why don't you join me by subscribing to our Voices for Voices TV show and podcast. You can find our social media handles or profiles on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, X, TikTok, as well as video on Vimeo, on our YouTube channel, and the audio file from all the podcasts, all the TV shows that we do on your favorite audio platform. If it's Apple Podcasts, if it's Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, Podcast Addict, wherever you look, you can find the Voices for Voices TV show and podcast. Programming note, in 2024, we as an organization are conducting a bi-weekly show called the Bi-Weekly Roundup, where we, on our Voices for Voices Facebook channel, we talk about current events that are affecting us as a community, as a city, as a state, as a county, as a nation, and as a member of the global society. Where we're able to answer and talk about, again, more current events that are closer in timing than when we were filming this particular episode and other episodes, where we film and then a period of time before we're able to air them. So that 2024 bi-weekly roundup, you can find that on our Voices for Voices Facebook page. Keep your eyes peeled for information coming up soon about our 4th annual Voices for Voices, A Brand New Day Gala happening in October. So it's hard to think that we're on our fourth anniversary of that event. Keep your eyes peeled for the lineup of music, of presenters, of award recipients. And again, as always, we have sign language interpretation from the Kent State University American Sign Language program. So it's always a joy to be able to bring that aspect to include that voice for those that are able to consume content in that manner. We, Voices for Voices, are a 501c3 nonprofit charity organization. We run solely on donations, so if you're able to, think about adding Voices for Voices to your 2024 giving plan. And if you would like to sponsor an episode of the TV show and podcast like this, if you would like to sponsor the Voices for Voices organization for a year, for a period of time, or you'd like to sponsor and be part of our 4th annual gala, please reach out to us on our voicesforvoices.org website. There's you can toggle to a contact button click that, and you can fill out a form, and that message comes directly to us. And you can also, if you like, email directly me in the organization at president@voicesforvoices.org. So today's episode is kind of part two of the conversation that we're going to have with our guest. The earlier podcast that you'll have seen last week will cover the content of what it's like to have a child on the autism spectrum, the different hurdles that have to be overcome to ensure getting your child the diagnosis if needed, and then the care of how we're going to help this child. And so we're going to have the same guest today, Mr. Dave Kagle. He's joining us from Columbus, Ohio. He is a personal friend for many years, and he is a wealth of information, which is why we're having 2 episodes, having him be so transparent and discussing his child on the autism spectrum. And in this episode, he's going to talk about job searching throughout the pandemic and changing jobs and careers as that a large impact on, I'd argue to say, almost all jobs that or a high percentage of jobs that are available. So he's going to give us his insight today. So Dave, thank you for joining us for the second episode.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you bet. So maybe we can open up the floor, and you can share your experience job searching, interviewing, changing jobs during the pandemic, and how that may have differed in earlier times when it wasn't a pandemic.
So, like a lot of folks early on in the pandemic, I found myself working remotely in a different situation, and the company I was working for made the decision to do a furlough. I feel like a lot of people were subject to that, depending upon the field you were in. The downside to my company is when they did that, as some of the months went on, the furlough turned into, no, those associates are not returning. The company was not doing as well as we had thought they were. So I found myself in a situation where I was taking on more job responsibility. Our pays had been frozen. In some cases, pay was cut.
Mm.
So, I found myself in a job role where I was taking on additional responsibilities with no promise of reward or anything in sight. It was really just kind of a keep the lights on situation. I was doing my best to go along with everything that was going on. Times were tough for everybody, but that was through the spring of 2020, and then through the summer when things started, I wouldn't say calm down, but when some of the picture of, okay, this is just kind of how things are going to be for a while, started to get, the picture became clearer on how things were going to work for a while. It was going to be, okay, people are going to work remotely. Essential employees will test, mask up, and show up. A lot of companies kind of adjusted to that on the fly and got back to business as usual. The company I worked for was just kind of holding steady. They had gotten to the point where they could continue to operate, but getting a pay cut back was not on the cards. Adding staff was just not on the cards. I made the difficult decision to seek other employment opportunities, and at that time, all the positions I had interviewed for had always been interview process was typically the application process didn't change, but my interviews were always in person. I never interviewed for a position that was outside of where I lived or not outside of a reasonable driving distance to be there for an interview. So I was not sure how it was going to go, but I was prepared. I said, well, I'll figure it out. I'll ask questions. So through the job application process, was worked pretty much the same as every other job search I've done. Uh, you know, things that were different is when it was called by recruiters and human resource representatives. It was no in-person interviews whatsoever for the positions I was looking for. I'm an IT professional by trade, so a lot of times they don't feel the need to. Sometimes they don't have you need come in person for during normal circumstances for those job roles, but it was no in-person interviews whatsoever. Um, I had to make sure that I had, first of all, like everyone else, I scrambled to find a decent webcam or made sure that the computer I had at the house or devices I had at the house had a decent webcam. Um, so it was, part of the interview, part of the setting up the interview process was a lot different. And to make sure, okay, you have to have a camera. Camera has to have a working microphone. And then back of my head, I have to make sure that I have my setup in an area of the house that I have some privacy. Check, put myself on camera. Look what's behind me. Make sure it's nothing that would be deemed unprofessional. Every company's different, so I had to adjust on the fly and questions you never really thought of before. It was always more concerned of, okay, what am I supposed to wear, or what suit or tie combination am I going to wear to this interview? You didn't really think about what room is it going to be in. Now all of a sudden you find yourself with, okay, um, I have to ask what attire is acceptable. Will I be full body on camera, or will I only be from the waist up? Um, Luckily the places I interviewed, they were completely fine with just how you and I are speaking now, waist up. So it was an adjustment. I still made sure I maintained whatever I always assume for business professional attire, but I was asked as well. But so a button-down shirt and a tie was good enough for a remote interview via Teams or Zoom or Cisco WebEx, whatever the company's preferred video conferencing technology was. That was that was something that was an adjustment. The second one was ensuring that I didn't have any distractions in the room that I was doing the interview. Typically, you go on site for an interview, they put you in a conference room. Some places may or may not make you turn in any personal electronic devices you have, no paper, no nothing. You kind of have to recite or have everything prepared from memory. So it was getting myself in a spot in the house where, okay, I don't have a bunch of distractions. The TV in the background's not turned on. I don't have to worry about somebody coming downstairs if I'm right now. My work from home setup's in the basement, so making sure no one comes downstairs, making sure microphone works, camera works, making sure the internet, a solid internet is there. Conducting the interview was mostly the same with the companies. There were a few instances where it was there were some difficulties with focusing because as an IT professional, I kind of stay on latest and greatest technology. But with some of these interviews, I could tell the individuals on the other end were either using company issued equipment to conduct the interview, or I believe one time someone was actually taking the phone taking the interview call from their cell phone, sitting in their car,
Uh,
and I wasn't going to let that affect my process, but I
Yeah.
just in my head I said, "Wow, how far we've come given the circumstances." And then I noticed too, one of the things that adjusted is rather than experience, at least from my perspective, for the positions I interviewed for, the companies I interviewed with, a lot of them, rather than doing multiple rounds of interviews, would schedule a longer video call and have all stakeholders on the one call.
Yeah.
And you would just take turns answering the questions for the whole group rather than meet with a potential counterpart and then come back and meet with a manager and then come back and meet with a director or a VP. It was everybody was in the room at the same time, just rapid fire.
Oh.
So making sure your eye position was good and you weren't, looking off at the ceiling or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
Those were some unique challenges um, as far as the interview process went. I know for me, the second factor in that was okay. You went through the interview process. It was similar in the follow-ups is, send a thank you email, or if some people are still writing thank you letters.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I know that's how you and I were coached in college
Yeah.
was to write thank you letter, but I feel like that might not be common practice much anymore.
Right.
You know, you get a return phone call from HR and they want to make you an offer. Because I actually changed jobs twice during the pandemic. Um, it was okay. Typically, you would have to come on site. In the past, I've had to come on site to do some sort of paperwork
Mm-hmm.
or drug testing, background check type stuff. And okay, how's that going to work? One company, they sent me everything through email, and it was okay. Here's all your paperwork. Sign it and either scan an email or if you have access to a fax machine, fax it back to us. Um, and oh, well, here's the information. Here's the facility you need to go to do standard drug tests for us. They'll take care of the results, but here's all the procedures you have to follow. I know the second time I changed jobs, I ended up having to go on site for some of the processes again.
Mm-hmm.
But at that time, we were almost a year into COVID, so we had protocols and procedure in place for that kind of stuff where we didn't have it in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
So, showing up, making sure I had my mask on, my hand sanitizer ready to go. I wasn't constantly fidgeting or, you know, touching too many things in the room I was in, and just it was an interesting, one of the more interesting things I've been through in my life. I will say, I feel like the interview, I felt like the interview process was a little bit easier.
Okay.
The stress, some people get overstressed by the entire interview process,
Mm.
not having to worry about. When I would interview in person before, I was one of those people that I like to get there early
Yeah.
and then I'd kind of chill out in the car for a minute to kind of calm down or,
Mm-hmm.
maybe chew some gum and make sure my breath was fresh and, make sure I was hydrated. Um, with the remote interviews, it was a little bit more relaxed. I wasn't as stressed out because I was at home or at my parents' house.
Mm-hmm.
So it was more of a relaxed, calming environment already. Um, the formalities of we don't, we're only going to see this. So you could wear sweatpants and slippers and your buttoned up shirt and tie, and it didn't make any difference.
Yeah. The differences, well, there's differences there, like you mentioned, there's some similarities with filling out an application and submitting profiles and in that, but from the actual interview itself, there were like also some similarities, uh, but there were some differences. Like you mentioned, having more people on the call, having just that easier where you might be have 4 or 5 different people on one interview, and like you said, it's just rapid fire, and you're trying to answer as best you can, and then another question comes, and then another question. Did you find yourself getting, well, the process might have been, and still is in many instances, very, very similar. Did you find yourself getting stressed at all, knowing that there were 5 people on the call versus one-on-one or one and two? I'm just curious.
One of the things I quickly learned, one of the things I adapted to was I would always ask the recruiter or HR representative how many individuals will be on the interview,
Okay.
so I could mentally prepare myself for those rapid fire situations. And they were more than happy to let me know. I interviewed for, I believe it was between both job searches.
Mm-hmm.
I had video interviews with five different five different uh, places.
Okay.
Um, one of the interviews was the most interesting because it was all audio.
Oh, okay.
There was no video. I was on camera, but the associates were not.
Oh,
And I don't know if that was I don't know if that was just a technology limitation or something, but um, knowing they could see me but I couldn't see them was kind of was very
very
interesting.
interesting. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking from being an instructor at Walsh University, those instances where we we have Zoom classes for one reason or another, and during the pandemic, that there were students, they would log in, but that you couldn't see their face. So are they laying in bed, or
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
what's going on? It's like they're like, well, I'm here, and so to have that be an interview, and have the job and the salary and the benefits, like all those things tied to it, and have it be so like the spotlight is just on you, like you're being interrogated,
Yep.
but you can't see the people that are interrogated. It's that is an interesting that's an interesting thought. So at the place of employment you're at now, we don't have to name it, but from a process standpoint, have the interviews process has changed at all since you've been there? So like somebody that's applying at your place of business, what is it completely changed, or is it very similar to when you went through that process?
From my perspective, and I'm not in a managerial position, so I don't get to participate in a lot of interviews, but
Okay.
in the 2.5 years I've been in this role, I've had helped interview some contractor candidates as well as some full-time candidates, and
Mm-hmm.
from an IT side, the process hasn't really adjusted that much.
Okay.
Uh, from an IT side, our initial interview is almost always done via Teams or our chosen collaboration video tool is Microsoft Teams. So
Mm-hmm.
almost all of our interviews are initially through Teams.
Okay.
So the initial interview is almost always that way, and it's a similar situation where we'll have a candidate, and then the group of us will all be on the same call.
Okay.
What's different a little bit in our situation is when I interviewed for this position, they had the entire reporting chain on the call.
Oh.
It was a situation where during my interview, I was on with a manager or two managers, two members of two two people who are on the same team I am, and then representatives from other teams in IT. And then 2/3 of the way through the call, they ended up adding a director.
Oh.
And I learned after the fact that they typically will add that certain director if they think you're a good candidate and they want to get that feedback immediately.
Okay.
That was kind of how they were handling things. Now with the processes, the interview is essentially with the hiring manager and then the team you're going to be working on, and then they'll actually do a second interview conducted with just leadership staff. So they
Okay.
have made an adjustment there, and I believe some of those interviews are still happening remote
Mm-hmm.
or happening in person, depending upon the job role. Different job roles, they want the person to come in,
Okay.
versus it's okay for them to be on camera.
Yeah, okay.
It just depends on the situation.
Good.
But yeah, the initial interview for sure is still, at least for IT
Mm-hmm.
positions. Yeah, it's through video call.
Great.
I think it just makes the whole process, it makes it a little bit easier on everybody.
All right. Yeah. Yeah. I can see how that makes more the most sense. Uh, so we're rapidly closing in on the end of this episode. From a professional standpoint, if a listener or viewer wants to learn more about you, your background, you're on LinkedIn, right? Somebody can find and add you as a connection and learn kind of what your background, and things that are of interest, from the personal standpoint, or not professional standpoint, beg your pardon. Any other, keeping the personal side out of it from Facebook and that, and keeping this, since this is more of a professional episode. Any other information that that you'd like to share about the topic in maybe a minute or so?
I guess I would just say, I think you and I take for granted that everyone gets sort of a crash course in proper interviewing. I know Youngstown State, I feel like did a pretty good job preparing us for, okay, this is how it might go. This is how it's going to be. This should be the expectation. The Williamson College of Business prepared us for that, and I take for granted that everybody knows basic interviewing etiquette. So my advice is, um, whenever you interview, make sure you dress appropriately. Ask what's appropriate attire. Don't assume. If you're going to be on camera, make sure that the area around you is deemed professional. I mean, it's okay to be in your basement or in your
Mm-hmm.
living room or in the kitchen, but if if you're in your bedroom, maybe blur that background, or
Yeah.
uh, turn the camera facing a different direction. I didn't do the interviews, but when they were interviewing for the position that I eventually got,
Mm-hmm.
some of the stories I heard, they told me were pretty funny, of just people not understanding interview etiquette.
Yeah. Great. Uh, well, Dave, thanks for joining us for the second episode, for being, again, transparent on the autism spectrum, and now with the job search, interviewing process. We thank you for your time and being able to share your expertise.
Yep. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. And this wouldn't happen without you, our viewers, our listeners. Thank you for joining this episode of the Voices for Voices TV show and podcast. Again, please subscribe, like, share this episode when you get an opportunity. And until next time, I am Justin Allen Hayes, founder and executive director of Voices for Voices, and we hope that you are a voice for you or somebody in need.